Everyone. So today we're going to look at political language, or at least primarily a political language. And I want to begin with a problem. This is actually a problem faced by the mayor of New York. So this is the context. About 2 days ago, early in the morning, a father was walking his young 6-year-old son to school. They were standing at an intersection. Now, nobody really knows what happened exactly. It seems that there was a drug dealer standing on the intersection behind them somewhere and approaching him two undercover cops. There was an exchange of gunfire. And the result was that this young 6-year-old boy was shot dead. The boy was African American. And needless to say, the African American community are up in arms about this event, furious. I mean, not least because it's the second time in around 6 weeks that something just like this has happened in their community. The mayor of New York decides that he will go to the boy's funeral. He's told not to go by his advisors. You are the last person they want to see at this funeral. They'll eat you alive. No, he says, no, I want to go. So he does, and this is our segue into analysing a political speech. Now, what I want you to do, please, as if we were in the classroom, is to pause this video and go to the other one that I've posted on eLearn, which you will see, and it's called Al Pacino City Hall Speech, okay? It lasts about 4 minutes or so. So please do that now and see what you think, okay? I'm assuming that you've now done that, all right? So what I'm going to do is bring the screen up, bring the speech up on the screen here. And the other text I'm going to bring up here takes us to some questions that we can ask about political language. Now, both these texts are on your eLearn platform, okay? All right, so questions to ask about political language. We do not forget all the stuff we've been learning, okay? The rhetorical strategies, the devices, the critique, all of that we're still going to be doing, but these questions help us to focus on the genre in front of us, which is, of course, political language here. They're very similar to the questions that we were looking at for advertising rhetoric. And we begin with the same question, repetition. What key words, images, symbols, phrases are repeated and why? And how is this repetition intended to influence the audience? What emotions or thoughts are engendered? Let's just look at this first paragraph here of the speech. What is the first key word or image repeated? I think it's pretty obvious, isn't it? It's that word warned. All right, we've noticed that. It's worth underlining it if you're actually analysing a speech, perhaps for your researchers, so you'll choose to do that. So we've noticed something, but of course you're familiar now with the process. You don't just notice something, you then ask why. Why is it there? And so I put that question to you. Why is the word warned used 1, 2, 3 times, 4 times in the first 3 lines? Didn't have to be, okay? So it's obviously being done for a reason. What do you think it is? Well, I think a couple of things to say here. Let's remind ourselves about kairos and prepon, about catching the attention of the audience. Let's describe the audience here. So they are upset, angry, seething, emotionally highly wrought. So the mayor understands that. He understands the energy in the room, and he understands how he needs to engage with this audience. It's no good his standing up there and talking straight away about statistics. No, anything cold, dry like that's not going to work. He needs to tap into the energy, and so he uses this very strong emotive word right from the beginning. So that's one reason. There's another reason. What does it say about him as a person, as a mayor? So this is taking us into ethos, isn't it? They warned me not to come here, but I'm here. I'm here. I'm here to be held to account. I'm not hiding. In other words, it conveys something about his character. He has strength of character. He has the balls, the cojones, to actually stand up and be counted. And it attaches, therefore, to his integrity and to, well, maybe not his integrity, but at least his prowess in his mind of what it is to be a mayor. So ethos, okay? There's another reason too. I think we'll talk more about it when we get to association, but the word here, warn, the repetition of it is helping to accentuate the distinction between us here in the church and them. Us together and them. They warned me. Well, you know, I'm here. I'm with you. So we'll come to that again in a moment. So all of these things are sort of bouncing around because of this simple repetition of the word. So what's the next key word, do you think, that is repeated in this first paragraph? If you're thinking the word I, that's really good to notice, and I want to come to that in a moment. But perhaps another one here is going to be the word stand. It's interesting, isn't it? Don't stand behind that coffin. And then don't stand behind. He says it again. And then he says, I must stand here. So we have a repetition here of a word, a powerful word again, 3 times. Again, at the beginning of this speech. Why? We notice it, we ask why. Why is he doing that? What's the big deal about that word? So, as I'm sure some of you are thinking right now, we have in English an idiom to stand up for something as a point of principle, if you like. So it sort of carries into or flows into what we've just been saying. I'm a man of principle. I'm here being held to account. I'm standing up for myself and for you. So there's that idiomatic meaning of the word stand here. There's more to it. And when we're stuck, what do? If you don't know the answer to what I'm asking you, you reach for contrast, guys. That's what you always should do if you're stuck. So reaching now for contrast, read on a bit. What do you see? I must stand here because I've not given you what you should have, period, until we can walk, until we can stroll. I mean, in the classroom, in my melodramatic way, I kind of stand and then I walk and then I stroll, but it sort of captures this flow, this movement. That's what contrast does. You remember, we've looked at this. It creates movement, dynamism in a text so that we're on a journey from A to B to C to wherever. And now this speech is on the move. And look at the imagery here that's being suggested in this movement. It's not just we can walk abroad, we can recreate ourselves. Look at the double meaning there. To recreate, it's like a recreation field, it's to play, but it has a double meaning, doesn't it? It means to recreate. That's really what this whole speech is about, is the recreation of something, from that into something better. Until we can stroll along the streets, here is a simile like boulevard. boulevards, not just streets. He could have stopped there, but he didn't. He wants to now characterize the street, make a beautiful image of the street. And it's a boulevard, this wonderful French word, of a tree-lined avenue, which is just lovely to walk down. Congregating in parks. So you have this idea of space and freedom and play and enjoyment. All really kicked off by this contrast, okay? Repetition we're still talking about here. I'm just noticing little details. I mean, you probably picked up the anaphora here, right? So until we, here's the dash, here's the climax, until that day, we have no city. So anaphora, of course, is a species of repetition, and it's used quite effectively here to create a little climax, or hook, if you like, at the end of this first paragraph. Do you remember what I was saying to you a while back? We were looking at that song, and I was talking to you about diction ropes and alliterative ropes, just sort of single words or sounds that can operate like a backbone or a spine of a text. Here we have the repetition of two nouns over and over again, which unifies the text. It almost creates a net here. The two keywords repeated throughout the text are, you tell me, city and palace. And again, it's a good idea to kind of work the text if you're analyzing, just by underlining perhaps different colors. And you'll see when you do that how the speech is kind of organized around these two words. And now that we've got this idea of a journey, a traverse, it sort of connects these two nouns in an interesting way. It's not just city and palace, it's city into a palace. That's the traverse he's trying to work in this, or create in this speech. Okay. Let's move on to the second question here, which is to do with association. Are there any explicit or implicit assertions of membership? Are there any associations made or implied with the use of visual images, colors, flags, music? And what emotions or thoughts are triggered by the associations being used? You see how we keep coming back to that question. What is the writer trying to do in you? What feelings and emotions are they trying to create in you? Well, let's go back to this first paragraph and think about association again. What do you notice here? Well, perhaps the first thing we should notice here, and I've already kind of commented on it, is this very powerful use of the first person I. And then we have a shift to we, third person. This is very characteristic of political rhetoric. If you think about it, politicians have that problem over and over again. They have to establish their credibility, their credentials, their ethos, why you should vote for me rather than the other people. But at some point, they have to basically get around your kitchen table and share your life and your problems as if they're one of you, us together. And so they need to do this kind of shift from I to we. It can be really clunky and difficult, or it can be done quite subtly. Here, you can see how he's trying to do it. It's all about me in the first 4 or 5 lines, isn't it? I must stand here, I must do this, But then look at the shift. until I've given you what you should have, until we can walk abroad, until we can stroll, our families, our children, our hearts joined, until that day we have no city. And so there you have the shift. He's then part of the group. He's bonding in that sense. The second paragraph is interesting because it's actually going to build on everything that we've been saying. The first, and perhaps only great mayor, was Greek. He was Pericles of Athens, and he lived some 2,500 years ago. What the hell's he doing here? Why is he suddenly talking about this dead dude from 2,500 years ago, right? Why? You tell me, what do you think he's doing here? What's happening in terms of association? Well, first thing to notice, this purportedly, supposedly great mayor was Greek. What's the name of this guy? Papas. That's a Greek name, all right? So there's a kind of very kind of not very subtle form of association there. I think that the next thing to say is something we've mentioned before. It's when we use authority figures in a way to set up an approximation of an ideal or perfection that we can get close to. So it is, again, I'll repeat, it's like the hockey player saying, I'm not like Gretzky, or the basketball player saying, well, I'm not as good as Jordan. I mean, everybody knows that, right? You can be. But the very fact you're saying that is setting up an ideal of perfection that everybody accepts, and then putting yourself, in correspondence, proximity to that, shall we say. And that can communicate modesty, but it also plants in people's minds that there is a proximity. So I think that's happening too. More importantly is what Pericles is supposed to have said here. All things good of this earth flow into the city. Now, who represents the city? Symbolically. Answer, the mayor. So what he's actually suggesting here, by way of association, is that all things good of this earth flow into the city, and therefore flow into me symbolically, because I represent the city. This is the game he's playing. Now, let's look at James, this little boy dead in that coffin. That boy was as pure and as innocent as the driven snow. That's a metaphor for you, which establishes his purity. Now look what he says. We were great once, can we not be great again? Now I put that question to James Bone, and there's only silence from this little boy. Yet could not something pass? Pass is another word for flow. From this sweet youth to, well, guess who? To me, Mayor Papas. And so we've got this association again of goodness and greatness flowing into, symbolically, metaphorically, into the man himself. The man standing up there giving the speech, the mayor. It's a political speech, it's all about me, right? So, next thing, down to the third paragraph, look how he now plays. It's sort of running with the ball. I choose to fight back, I choose to live, not die. And I know that what's within me, all this goodness that's in me as mayor of this city, from the goodness of this boy, I know that what's within me is also within you. And now we've got this communion, this flowing into and out of each other of all this goodness that's coming from the earth and from this little boy, and we're now sharing it in bond. It's an extraordinary kind of association he's trying to pull off here. Whether he actually does is something we'll come to in a moment. But it gets, I was going to say worse, or it gets more extraordinary when we get to the end of the speech. Again, thinking about association here. So he's, standing behind this coffin, and he's talking about rebuilding on the soul of this little warrior. And then he says, I should just raise the text a bit here. Yeah. He says to everybody, I am with you, little James. But actually, he's doing more than that. He's opening the coffin lid and lying down inside. I am you, James. It's not just that I'm with you. It's I am you. I am the city. I am the mayor. I suffered 2 days ago with that bullet. And we have this extraordinary metaphor of himself now that he's creating as mayor, using all these associations on the way. Next question here, composition. What are the key content words? I think we've kind of looked at that, palace, city, so on. Key themes, I think we're getting there, this idea of transition and flowing from something bad to something better. Sequence of ideas. Why is the speech structured the way it is? Is there a build-up to a climax? If so, how is this build-up created? There's nearly always going to be a build-up to a climax in a political speech of any length, shall we say. The first really obvious thing you can notice, and this is, I've mentioned before about how I want you to look at texts when they first appear on the screen or on the table in front of you. Just look at paragraph structure, print, what I actually see here. And what you will see is a text almost going into a diamond point with paragraphs becoming more and more condensed into that penultimate line and then these 3 words at the very bottom. So you have that kind of thrust like that. But you also have here a sequence of ideas that is very common in political speeches. It's tripartite, which means, of course, 3 parts. The first part, people call this in different ways, but we can call it the truth section, the problem section, this is the shit we're in section. That's very often how speeches begin. And we then shift to what you might call the angry section. Here, I think probably after the first 2 paragraphs, we're moving into the angry section. You can remember from the speech, I choose to fight back, I choose to rise, not fall. And so he's building up his own sort of presence and tone and volume in the speech. And then we get to the 3rd section, which we call the can-do section. So this is that part of the speech towards the end, which is offering a resolution, a solution. This is what we can do to solve the problem. And you will perhaps be surprised by how often you see that tripartite structure operating in speeches. This other question here about composition, is there any deliberate use of rhetoric pitched to the audience? That's pretty obvious here, isn't it, guys? I think, he's just taken over from a preacher. What is the audience here? What is the context? It's a church. So, he's pitching language deliberately for audience in that sense, kairos and prepon, right? So you see, particularly at the end here, we have biblical references. It's not just a dead young child, it's an angel. So, we will rise up on the wings of this slain angel. And this idea of rising up, of course, carries into this Christian idea of resurrection, of rebirth. Remember, recreate ourselves. It's compounding this image. Now it's a biblical allusion to resurrection. And it's not just a palace. It's going to be a palace of God, because that's what these people want to hear. He's in many ways working the audience just like a preacher would. A preacher often uses the rhetorical question. So you ask a question knowing that everybody's going to give the same answer, and then you give that answer as it were in unison. And so this is, if you remember, and we're going to see the speech again in a moment, this is how everybody's responding. He's working them up and building up their emotion here. Whilst I say the word emotion, why don't I ask you this very obvious question? What is the primary rhetorical strategy being used in this speech? Obvious answer, right? It's pathos. Of course it is. It's predominantly pathos. I think there are elements of ethos too. Whenever, I mean, we talked about the way he's trying to establish his credibility and his strength. They warn me not to be here, but I'm here. So there's an association. I told you I would mention that, but it's the us versus them sort of contrast and association bonding of us together. The threat is outside. That's an important association that's used often in political speeches. But yeah, I think here the idea is that the more you appeal to your audience emotionally in terms of pathos, the less you have to address them in terms of logos. And that is the strategy profile, if you like, of most political speeches. They will be pitched in terms of pathos and a little bit of ethos, and much less in terms of logos. I mean, to be fair to politicians, logos suggests pretty dry statistical logical presentation of argument vis-a-vis policy, for example. And the problem politicians have, particularly today, is they know that if they stand up for 2 hours talking in detail about policy, it's just going to end up as a 20-second soundbite. So it is difficult, And also people get bored, don't they? They get bored with statistics and facts and stuff like that. But at least what you can say about the people in this audience is that they're not bored. Okay, so we've noticed that about the political strategies being used here. Right, now, just as we did with advertising, we should be looking out for omission, diversion, and confusion. Is there any recognition of counter-argument? Is anything being covered up? What fallacies are at work? Straw person, red herring, ad hominem attacks. Is the audience being deliberately maneuvered away from something difficult or embarrassing? And then we've got at the bottom here, is there any jargon or any diction which is deliberately confusing? I think if you remember the little speech by Donald Rumsfeld we looked at, I think in the last video or just before that, I mean, that would be an example of deliberate confusion, I think, obfuscation. What would you say here if you were analysing this speech by Mayor Pappas in terms of omission, diversion, and confusion? What would you say? I think what I would be saying flows from what I've just been saying about pathos and logos. It is so highly wrought, this speech, so emotional, as to amount to hot air, really, in many ways. I mean, at least I think we need to be careful here and think about context, first of all. What is the context right now? I'm staring at a video screen. You're doing the same. We don't really want to be doing this. Or if we do, great. But, I don't know. But it's almost impossible, or at least it's very difficult for us to imagine being in that church, isn't it? But imagine, try to, that you are, that you knew that boy, that you genuinely are upset. And then the speech starts to work, perhaps. But when we stand back and look at it, if you like, in the cold light of day, I think we realize because of its pathos, there's almost nothing substantive being said here at all. Where is, number one, where's the apology? I mean, who's the guy who's ultimately responsible for what happens in New York? Isn't it the mayor, symbolically? Isn't that exactly the point he's trying to say when he's talking about, the goodness flows into me as the mayor? Okay, right, so the buck stops with you, mate. Aren't you the guy responsible for this? What are you going to do about it? Doesn't seem to me he's answering that problem. Where is the promise of an investigation? Particularly if it's the second time it's happened in recent, weeks. Where is the promise of more money to be spent on police, on the streets, protecting people? It's not there, right? So you bet there's a mission. An awful lot that's not being said here that probably should be said. Whether he gets away with it or not, I suppose, is for you to judge. And again, we're not in that church, right? Fallacies, I mean, it's filled with hasty generalizations, isn't it? And slippery slopes and all sorts of things. If we want to critique it in terms of, logical problems, then I guess we'd have no problem doing that. All right, so what I want to do now is just investigate in a bit more detail how we can talk about the genre of this speech. I mean, yeah, it's political speech, of course it is. But if you just go, actually, it's to the first page of this sheet I put on eLearn for you. You can see we have some more information about the genre. I would actually say what we have here are subgenres. So if, as we've discussed, political language is a genre, then it can be said that there are three types or subgenres of political language. So the first one we come to is election group rhetoric, and look at the basic claim. I'm competent, trustworthy, this is the ethos. From me, you will get more good things than bad things, and obviously vice versa. And it's usually asserted in terms of competency, trustworthiness, benevolence. Trustworthiness just reminds me of, I think, the accusation against Bill Clinton so many years ago was that he smoked marijuana at university. And his response was, well, yes, I did smoke marijuana at university, but I didn't inhale. I mean, it's wonderful, isn't it, the games that are played here at times. This is interesting, I think. Benevolence, usually asserted in terms of promise. So politicians are essentially benefit promisers. And politicians in power tend to adopt conservative rhetoric, associating benefits in terms of securing what we already have and avoiding combating threat. And politicians trying to gain power tend to adopt progressive rhetoric, emphasizing change. I mean, this is perfectly set up for us, guys, when you think about the American election, which is, 2 months away. The way in which the two key politicians here are positioning themselves. One, in terms of conservative rhetoric and the threats that are out there unless he stays in power, and the other one in terms of the need for change. I remember the presidential debates, or one of them in particular, between Obama when he was already in power and trying to get a second term, and Mitt Romney, who was the Republican against him. And what was so interesting in these debates, for me at least, was the way in which they seemed to be wearing the wrong rhetorical jackets for their own sort of personalities and temperaments. Obama was sort of adopting, because he was already in power, this conservative, rhetoric that we're talking about here. And Romney, who is, he's a Mormon from Utah, right? I think he's about as conservative as it comes, was sort of trying to come across as the progressive, the guy who stands for change. There was a kind of weird dissonance going on in these debates. Neither of them actually felt, it seemed to me, comfortable with the language that they were sort of having to use here. Very interesting rhetorically, I think. Okay, cause group rhetoric. This is another subgenre. And look at the basic mode here of the subgenre. We have the threat, the bonding, the cause, the response. It's essentially a pep talk. I'm going to come to that actually in a moment. So, you know, you look out for the warnings, popular fears, so on, and then you try to bond against those fears. Then you have a cause, what it's all for, and then you have a response, right? So, example might be George Bush, the famous speech he gave just after 9/11. So, you know, the threat there was the burning Twin Towers. The bonding, do you remember it was you're either with us or against us? The cause, war on terror, war against, I guess, fundamentalist Islam, and the response, war on terror. And there we are. It's a very good example, I think, of how that operates. And it can sort of segue into war propaganda, and look at the distinctions here we should be aware of: propaganda directed at an internal audience and psychological warfare directed at the enemy. So, and words with propaganda become more and more abstract and emotive, and metaphoric. So, you know, look for language used to intensify feelings of one's own good. Look for claims of virtue and justice with reference to popular heroes, stories of obedience and bravery, and then language used to intensify the other's badness. Look for dehumanizing rhetoric as well as verbal aggression and name calling. Just thinking of something I did way back in school, we were contrasting or looking at the nursery rhymes given to children in the First World War. You know, dehumanizing the Germans or dehumanizing the French and the British and the Canadians and so on. So, you know, and that was to children. It's very disturbing how that can happen. So let us now think about the speech by Mayor Pappas in terms of subgenre. Yes, of course, in an analysis we would say this is an example of political speech making. Yeah, absolutely. But in terms of subgenre, what do you think it is? Just take a couple of moments to think about that. So I imagine most of you have identified cause group rhetoric as the one that seems to operate here. I think that's right, predominantly. I think there is an element of electoral rhetoric. The moment a politician promises anything or pledges anything, it's the same word for promise, there's an election coming down the track, right? It's nearly always inevitable. And he does that at the end of the first paragraph. He does this sort of segue or traverse from I to we. We've talked about that. This is what we want. We want a city that's going to be like that. And then he says, you can label me a failure until that day. In other words, I promise you, vote for me next time, and I'm going to make this city a palace of God. Right? So I think there's an element of electoral language here, but it's predominantly cause group. So what is the threat for Mayor Pappas in this speech? It's what happened 2 days ago. It's what happened to this little boy. It's what's happening on the streets. The bonding. We talked about this, and I know that what's within me is also within you. This is our bond. The cause, we will avenge the death of this slain angel. We'll rise up on the wings of this slain angel. And that's the response, isn't it? We will carry it forward, pick up his standard, raise it high, and rise up. Yeah, absolutely, it's cause group. I don't think there's war propaganda here, really. Maybe you can find elements or traces of it. I don't think it's there. But I think we have cause group, and I think we have electoral group rhetoric. And as for the can do here, as for the rise up, what the hell does that mean? we're all going to rise up. But is that going to solve these problems? Maybe for the people in the church, at that moment, that's what they want to hear. That's what they need to hear. Right, so what I want you to do now, please, again, this is what I do in the classroom, is having gone through all of this, I play the speech again. Because I think it really helps to capture a lot of the things we've been saying. So that's what I'd like you to do, please. I'd like you to pause this video, go back to the City Hall speech, and play that through again. And hopefully it will resonate in a rather sort of more substantive way. Okay, I'll leave that with you. You know, we could, I could do, if you like, a video on body language, the rhetoric of body language. And I think it's in evidence very much in this speech. I mean, I think we tend to fall into the trap of thinking that we wave our hands around, and God knows I do it far too much, but because we don't know what we're saying, but actually it's the other way around. It's coming from what we're saying. Our whole body is kind of textual in that sense. I mean, you don't need the director to say to Al Pacino, Al, can you please go and stand behind the coffin? Of course he's going to do that. The text demands that he does that. And I know that what's within me is also within you. We will rise up, raise his standard. See, it's coming from the text, actually. This is how it's working. All right, that was a little tangent, wasn't it? What I want to do now is look at a real speech, which is to say that is fictive. It's a film, but I thought it was helpful for us in terms of analysis. This is actually a speech given by Richard Nixon, 1969, at the Republican convention. So he was trying to become president, if you like, and he's very much pitching this, preaching to the choir, or to his own people, shall we say. It's at the actual convention of Republicans. And the sort of background context here is the Vietnam War. What I'd like you to do, and I ask students to do this in class, is to read through this and then to work it using the handout that I've given you. So consider the genre. Well, obviously it's political, but consider the subgenre. What subgenre do you think this speech belongs to? And remember, these are not mutually exclusive, these subgenres. It's not like it's one or the other. In fact, it can be all three. It could be electoral, cause group, and war propaganda. So usually it's kind of a weighted combination of these subgenres. So ask yourself that question. And then go through the other questions that we began with. So, you know, repetition, associations, omission, diversion, confusion. See what you come up with. And I normally give students about 10 minutes or so to work on that. And so why don't I do that now? And then we'll hook up together and go through this, okay? Okay, so why don't we analyze this sort of in the reverse way from the way that we analyze the Pappas speech. So beginning with subgenre. What do you think? I think, at least as I see it, we've got something which is predominantly cause group. The threat is set out for us in the first paragraph. This is all the problem that is being faced at the moment. The bonding is us, quiet majority of non-demonstrators and taxpayers, so he's trying to do that. The cause is going to be the truth, I suppose, or making America great again. I can't believe I just said that. And the result is going to be, well, you know, vote for me, and this is what we can do at the end. And of course, that takes us into the tripartite structure of the speech. I'm almost embarrassed to give you this speech. I mean, the truth section finishes with the word truth repeated was it 3 times, 4 times? The angry section um, contains the word angry. And then we have the can-do section at the bottom here. I think it's also electoral. Of course it is. He's making promises. At the end of this second paragraph, he says, I pledge to you that the current wave of violence will not be the wave of the future. So I think we have this weighted combination, primarily cause group, subgenre with some electoral rhetoric too. If you see some more propaganda, fine. I don't myself, but anyway, that's what I would be saying there. And then we've got the structure, the tripartite structure. If we then turn to sort of general rhetorical strategy, that's pretty clear, isn't it? This is predominantly a pathos-oriented speech. And we'd expect that, and it is, very much so. A little bit of ethos with the references to himself as being the route forward, but this is predominantly pathos. And it's driven by, especially by the device of hyperbole, the rhetorical device of hyperbole. This is sort of exaggeration of everything here. We see cities enveloped in smoke and flame, millions of Americans crying out in anguish. Do you think if they opened the windows, they would have heard millions of Americans crying out in anguish? We've got references not just to Americans dying in Normandy, but boys, because that's worse, right? It's supposed to tug even more on our heartstrings. References to the Second World War, to the American Revolution, Valley Forge, so he's trying to stretch it across time here. So yeah, this is very hyperbolic, and it's very emotive. So the hyperbole and the imagery and the metaphors here are pushing the pathos. That's kind of the main rhetorical strategy at work here. Now then, if we turn to the questions, repetition, association, confusion, diversion. In terms of repetition, I'm sure you've picked up all sorts of things going through this. We've got a little bit of anaphora, haven't we? When thee, when a, when thee, when thee. And then it is time for new leadership. So we've got that repetitive device of anaphora at work in the first paragraph. We have repetition of the notion of American and Americanness. So that's happening here. Association. There's an attempt to associate himself with the group, the quiet, silent voice of the majority, the ones who are the non-shouters, the non-demonstrators. And so part of this association at work in political speech, as we talked about previously, is nearly always setting up an us versus them antagonism. So they're the ones we should be concerned about. They're the ones who are demonstrating against the war. They're the Democrats, all right? The noisy ones. We are the good ones, the tax-paying sort of Republicans. And he tries to reach out to ethnic groups and sort of falls flat on his face, arguably, by missing out so many ethnic groups. So that's his attempt to associate there. Trying to create friendship, a friendship bond here. Here we are, my friends. So I think we have that happening. And the association sort of segue between first person and the we, third person, plural, which we saw happening at the beginning of the Papa speech, is happening almost in reverse here. It's at the end that he then presents himself as the ego person who will carry us forward here. I say to you tonight, he repeats it, I say to you tonight, we must have a new feeling. And basically the reference is, vote for me, and I will take America from where it is now to where it can be. This shift, this traverse from city to palace, from the America in trouble the way it is now to something better, is often using the rhetorical device of antithesis. This is the use of opposites and extreme contrasts in sort of juxtaposition next to each other, which establish this idea of traverse or movement from A to B. So there's a rhetorical device underneath it, which it's doing it. There nearly always is, right? That's the point. Okay, so I mean, in terms of language pitched to the audience, it's very patriotic language, isn't it? So he knows what his audience wants to hear, and so he's giving them the imagery that they want, the emotions that they want to feel, the references that they want. It's a patriotic, almost xenophobic speech in that sense. If we look at omission and diversion, I think most of us looking at this would say, just as we did with the Papa speech, there's really nothing here, nothing substantive being said at all in terms of policy, in terms of what's actually going to happen. He's just making these hasty generalizations and hasty claims. And really there's nothing here except hot air and emotion. I tend to agree. I think that's kind of how I feel about this. But the one sort of caveat or qualification is that we should never forget different audiences, and in particular the unintended audience. Because if he's writing the speech, pitching it to the audience inside that Republican convention, this is also a public speech. It's a speech that will be broadcast. And if you happen to be reading this speech or hearing about it in 1969, living in West Germany or anywhere in Western Europe, and of course we're still very much in the Cold War, this reference at the end here, when he says we can reduce our conventional forces in Europe, you'd be thinking, holy shit, you know, that's actually a threat to NATO, and we really need NATO. That's what you might be thinking in 1969, okay, if you were in Western Europe. So suddenly this speech would be saying something substantive, and you might react therefore to the speech in a different way. Okay, now, what I want to do next is to segue from talking specifically about political speeches to something that might actually be more relevant to your lives down the track, which is the pep talk. We just made a brief reference to it earlier. What is the pep talk? The pep talk is the team building talk. And it doesn't have to be, you know, in front of a huge group of people. It could be team building in front of 3 people who are just not doing what needs to be done, and you own the business, right? So there are different contexts in which you might be in a kind of quasi-leadership role or management role where you really do need to get people around the table and have a bit of a crisis talk. You know, things are going to shit, and this is what we've got to do. So what I want to do is take you to a couple of very different speeches from vastly different contexts and show you how so many of the things we've been talking about analyzing political language are used and can be found in pep talks. The first example takes us to another problem. The problem here is you have a general or a commander of soldiers, troop, a battalion, whatever, of soldiers. They've been marching all night. They're cold, wet, exhausted, famished, and they've got to fight now, pretty much now, against the enemy ranged on the hills over there, which vastly outnumber us. And in that situation, really, language is the only thing you've got to turn this rabble into a fighting and effective force. You may not care about any of that, but think about this as a rhetorical challenge. And what I want you to do now, please, is go to the video I've posted, which is called Henry V St. Crispin's Day speech. It's actually a speech by Shakespeare, written by Shakespeare from his play, Henry V. No matter how much you detest the thought of it, please go there now. It's about 4 minutes long. It's not going to kill you. Check it out. Check it out. Please do. And then get back to me. All right, rather than pausing this video, I'm going to assume that you did that. And now I want to take you to the next video that I posted on eLearn, right next to the Shakespeare one. This is much more contemporary. It brings back our favorite Al Pacino, one of my favorite actors, at least Al Pacino. A very famous speech. I think it's from the film Any Given Sunday. And it presents us with a coach who's having to motivate his team who are performing terribly. Here we are at halftime or whatever. And he's got to turn them into a winning outfit. Again, please, just go there. Even if you know the speech, just go back to it, please. Have a look at it. And again, it's just, 4 minutes or so. And then come back to me here, okay? Now, I've posted this speech on eLearn as a text for you. You can easily find the Shakespeare one if you want to. It's from the play Henry V. Or just ask me. But I think without going through this forensically, what I want to do is capture how these two speeches are using so many of the elements we've been discussing. Think about that tripartite structure. All right, both of these guys, the king and the coach here, are beginning by saying, this is the ship we're in. We're outnumbered. Yeah, okay. Or, we're getting beaten. They begin with that truth problem section. Then they become more animated and angry, particularly in this speech by the coach. We're going to fight for that inch. We're going to claw for it. And then we get to the can-do sections. This is what we're going to do to solve the problem, to do what we've got to do next. So you still have that structure at work here. If we just look at this speech from Any Given Sunday, we've got all sorts of repetitions and associations at work that we should be familiar with now. It's of course pathos. I almost don't need to say that now, right? I mean, both these speeches are all about emotion rather than logic. So, I mean, that's the rhetorical strategy, and it's driven by all sorts of devices at work here: imagery, metaphors, hyperboles. Here we have the repetition of the word inch over and over again. So there is that spine of this particular speech. It's that notion of the inch which comes threads throughout, and it's used metaphorically. So life is a game. There's the metaphor. Life is a game of inches. So we have an extended metaphor there. The associations at work here. We have somebody who talks about himself personally here. I don't know what to say. I basically screwed up my life, fucked it up. I've blown away all my money. All the people I've loved have left me. I can't even bear to look at myself in the mirror now. What he's basically saying is, I've been there, I've done it, I've got the t-shirt. I'm a mature, older person than you guys in the dressing room. I know what I'm talking about. But he then kind of disappears, and the speech then moves into the team, what it is, and together how we will operate. Yeah, on this team, we fight for that inch. We tear ourselves and everyone around us. We claw. We know. And so it's together. This is the bonding here, all right? It's fascinating what he's doing with this notion of images and team. Maybe the best way to analyze this is to contrast these two speeches, the Shakespeare Henry speech and this Al Pacino coach speech, in terms of audience, in terms of, kairos, what's appropriate for the audience and prep on. Henry appeals to his audience in terms of honor and glory and patrie and religion and family. And none of those images, none of those appeals will work in the context of the dressing room with Al Pacino as coach. None of that stuff's going to work. These guys are from the ghetto. And Pacino knows that. The coach knows that. He's got to find something that they will relate to, they will associate with. And so he creates a notion of a team that is not the team that Henry's talking about 400 or 500 years ago. This is a team of individuals. This is an aggregation of individuals pursuing self-interest, because that's the one thing these guys can rely on the guy next to them. He's out for himself. So if that's the case, and we're all out for ourselves, then if we aggregate that, and we can create a communion of self-interest, as it were, all pursuing the same goal. And he pitches it to them like that. It's very, very clever, I think, the way that he does that. Okay, well, I will leave you to ruminate on those two speeches and to draw out other comparisons and contrasts as you wish. The final thing I want to look at today, also hopefully helpful to you in your other classes and perhaps down the track, is what we call the 5 canons of rhetoric. So don't shoot yourself. It's not necessarily boring, and just because it comes from the ancient world doesn't mean to say it's irrelevant. Far from it. We're going back to Cicero here, 50 BC, and his key work on rhetoric called the Inventione. And then that was developed by Quintilian, 95 AD. So thinking about this, you don't need to learn this stuff, guys, but the more you kind of ingest it and get used to it, the more you will retain it and the more it might be useful to you down the track. Think of these 5 different canons, or principles, if you like, of rhetoric. Inventio, invention, the process of developing and refining your arguments. Dispositio, arrangement, the process of arranging and organizing your arguments for maximum impact. Elocutio, style, the process of determining how you present your arguments using figures of speech and other rhetorical techniques. Memoria, process of learning and memorizing your speech so you can deliver it without the use of notes. And then actio, delivery, the process of practicing how you deliver your speech using gestures, pronunciation, and tone of voice. Now, I think it's fair to say the last 2 are not sort of relevant so much for English 100, maybe in a communications class or in a public speaking class. Number 3, we've been working on all this time, elocutio, which is actually rhetorical strategies and devices, how we, arrange our arguments in a way that will be effective. And so what I want to talk about briefly in the next couple of minutes or so is really the first 2, invention and arrangement. But actually, before I do so, just something on memory, now that it occurs to me. I was watching a TV drama the other day called The Bridge. You may or may not have come across it. I think this began as a Scandinavian drama, and then it was redone using the Channel Tunnel between the England and France. The idea is that you have a mysterious death, and the body is placed exactly in the middle of the tunnel. This is quite a clever concept. And so partly what that means is that you have 2 police forces that have to liaise with each other. Swedish and Denmark in the first TV drama. Here it's English and French, and that creates, the part of the atmosphere in the drama. In both of these TV dramas, you had a very smart but weird detective. You think of Sherlock Holmes, and you got something similar, right? Somebody who is literally an oddball and doesn't quite fit in with society, but for whatever reasons, is capable of solving cases brilliantly. All right, I mean, you're familiar with this stuff. The reason I mention it is because in the Anglo-French version, the brilliant French detective finally explains how she's able to piece things together. And she talks about a memory house. So she says, I imagine a house. This is where I grew up. And I walk through it, and I remember things that way because I placed them in certain rooms for certain reasons. And I remember there was another reference to this in an episode of Sherlock Holmes in the TV drama that was done fairly recently. But what's perhaps interesting is that this is not a new idea. This is Cicero. He actually talks about the method of loci. I guess loci in the sense of location. And how in his rhetoric or his work he talks about the palace, and so you walk through the palace and you put important things in one room and then in another room, and maybe you categorize, so the ground floor is the most important things to remember, and then the upper floors take you to the less important, or vice versa. It's up to you. And I've also come across a reference to that idiom we have in English, in the first place, da 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 da, in the second place, this. It seems as though it comes from this ancient method of loci, of, what we're actually saying when we use that idiom is, in the first place in my memory house, I want to say this, this, and this. And in the second place, in my memory place, I want to say this. So anyway, I just thought I'd mention it because I found it useful, and you might do too. All right, now let's just move on and look at the last bit here. The invention often begins as a lengthy period of reflection and thinking about issues that we've made ourselves informed about. In the CAP Guide to Writing, there's that section on how to formulate a thesis. Well, it's this, right? So what we do during this process of germination, if you like, or invention, of making ourselves informed, is we should, as far as possible, put our brains in neutral. Don't carry into your research prejudice, preconceived ideas. Try to just put all of that at one side and say, okay, I'm going to come into this topic afresh. And I'm just going to ingest what I read, and then I'm going to make a decision. Okay? This is how we can avoid making hasty judgments. Only after have we done research should we then actually think about how we need to judge the topic. Then, in deciding how to go about arranging and developing our argument, we should begin by thinking about our audience. What does our audience fear? What does it desire? What are its needs? Ask these questions when you've got a little pep talk to do in front of your team and you're the manager. What are they frightened of? Maybe they're frightened they're going to lose their jobs. Well, you need to think about that. Maybe they're concerned about their salaries. Maybe they're concerned about being on short-term contracts and not longer contracts. These are the things you need to ask yourself and be aware of as you start to construct your speech or your email, whatever it's going to be. Then, how are we going to convince them? Okay, so we need to bring evidence into our argument. That could be facts, it could be statistics, it could be references to laws, it could be references to company corporate documents, policies, corporate policy documents, whatever. So this is what we might be using. It may be individual testimony. And we should try to have a blend of different evidence. But again, remember the audience. Some types of audience will respond better to logic and statistical evidence, while others will respond better to emotional and personal evidence. And guess what? Figuring that out is then going to lead you to one of the three strategies. Okay? Pathos, ethos, logos, which is going to be the most effective strategy given the context that you have to deal with. And this is where we think about kairos, prepon, especially if we're actually going to be delivering a speech. But you know what? Even when it comes to emails, when do you send the email? Do you send it first thing in the morning? Do you send it perhaps strategically, late in the evening after hopefully people have had a drink and they're more relaxed? You need to make these decisions. And it goes exactly to prepon. What's the right time? And kairos, when is the right window here? Particularly if you're asking for something. Particularly if you're asking for something and somebody's really not going to like what they're being asked for. Time it right. Psychology's part of this, isn't it? Now, just a few other words of advice I thought we would think about here. And again, we're talking about developing an argument. Definition. This is often crucial to the success or otherwise of an argument. So yeah, I'm going to talk more about this when we talk about legal rhetoric. But I think the point is made here. Basically, whoever can establish the meaning of an idea or word will be the one more likely to persuade. And that may involve framing the topic in a certain way, stating how a particular topic or idea should be referred to or classified. Just related to that and to do with your research paper, I sometimes have students worrying that there's so much, how can they possibly deal with all of that in just 4 pages? I want to analyze the speech, a student will say to me, but the politician's talking about so many things. I mean, how can I? So the answer is at the beginning of your essay to do just this: corral, section off that part of the speech that you want to deal with. And then you're telling the reader at the start of your essay, that's all I'm doing. I'm not dealing with these other things. I'm just, so the politician's talking about all sorts of things. I'm going to focus on what he or she is talking about in terms of the environment or in terms of health policy. Yeah? So you manage in that way. Comparison and contrast. I keep hammering away at this, don't I, how useful it is for you. And it's a useful way to organize your essays and your ideas. And don't forget the power of metaphoric language here. More again on this down the track, but your argument can be made stronger if you can compare it to something already believed, liked, or accepted by your audience. Cause and effect. This is where you can use statistical evidence or logic to argue that if we pursue X, then Y is bound to follow. It's very characteristic of technical writing, scientific writing, expository writing. Very appropriate for that. It can also be very effective in prose essays where you're arguing for or against something, but beware of the fallacy of slippery slope, where in fact it just becomes false when it's not necessarily the case that Y is going to follow X. And finally, circumstance. This is where you can introduce into your argument, into your essay, a recognition of what is realistic or doable under the circumstances. It's that moment in your argument when you can allow yourself perhaps to soften your approach a bit, perhaps recognizing the limits of what you're arguing for, and perhaps also recognizing, if not actually validating, alternate positions, okay? Which is a very academic thing to do. Yes, be forceful. Yes, have opinions, but not to the point of being opinionated, okay? And this is what I told you about in the very first class. Okay, I think that's it for today. In the next class, we'll talk about legal rhetoric and do maybe just a little bit more work on grammar, okay? Thanks for your time and see you next time.